It is September 16th, 2000, and a man calls the London Emergency Dispatch Center. He speaks very calmly and clearly. He wants the police to come to his home. He has just had an argument with his partner and fears that the situation might escalate. The dispatcher on the other end of the line does not seem to fully understand what the man's problem is, but the man reiterates his request. He wants the police to come and separate him and his girlfriend. He says, "I'd like someone here to stop us from hurting each other." But no one comes, and the man's fears are realized. One of the two will soon be dead. It's the 1970s, and we're in a town that's now known as the poorest in all of England, Grimsby. The general feeling is that no one wants to live in Grimsby, but some people just have to. This is also true for the family of Jane Andrews, born in 1967. Her parents always worked, but the money still wasn't enough to make ends meet. The Andrews used to live in their own house, but they had to sell it, and now they live instead in a modest row house in Grimsby. The house doesn't even have a bathroom. The toilet is outside. There's no doubt that Jane Andrews didn't have a particularly happy childhood. As a teenager, she once took an overdose of medication. Her mother found her just in time. During those years, Jane struggled repeatedly. She was caught in a vicious cycle of depression, panic attacks, and disordered eating. A child like Jane actually desperately needs support and help, but that's something you rarely find in places like Grimsby. At the age of 17, she becomes pregnant unintentionally and decides not to keep the child. She simply knows she wouldn't be able to take care of a child. She does manage to graduate from high school, though her grades aren't great. In other words, even as she enters adulthood, Jane has already experienced many things that are difficult to cope with. By the age of 21, she has at least found a job. She works as a sales clerk at an M&S supermarket branch. It was actually always her dream to work in fashion, but that's a long way off. She has taken college courses on the subject and is a good seamstress, but finding a job in a city like Grimsby is like looking for the proverbial needle in a haystack. And the main thing is that she's earning money at all. Until one day, by chance, she spots a job ad in a magazine. She enjoys reading the Lady magazine whenever she gets her hands on an issue. It's mostly about fashion, high-end fashion, and a few updates from the celebrity world. And then suddenly, there's this job offer, specifically as a personal dresser. It doesn't say who posted the ad. The whole thing is anonymous. It just says that a busy mother needs an assistant. Many people might just flip past an ad like that, thinking it's completely untrustworthy. But for Jane Andrews, this job ad is a glimmer of hope. This could be her way out of Grimsby. So she writes an application and hears nothing for 6 months. Until suddenly, an invitation to an interview arrives. Only now does it become clear who posted the job ad, and that Jane has a huge opportunity ahead of her. Because the job offer came from none other than Fergie of the royal family, the Duchess of York. At the time, Fergie was the wife of Andrew Albert Christian Edward Mountbatten Windsor, or as he was still known back then, Prince Andrew. At the time, he was fourth in line to the British throne. Well, and I think we all know Prince Andrew by now. In the 1980s, Prince Andrew and his wife Sarah Ferguson were just ordinary members of the royal family, and that's where Jane Andrews is now set to go for her job interview. In July 1988, Jane is hired as Fergie's personal dresser. She moves straight from her humble home in Grimsby to Buckingham Palace. Jane is 21 years old and can finally leave her difficult childhood in Grimsby behind her. She adapts to her surroundings as best she can. First and foremost, she naturally puts a lot of effort into her job. But she also changes her style of dress and tries to adjust her accent so as not to sound too much like the English working class. Soon, Jane becomes a permanent member of Fergie's staff, and in April 1989, she also meets her future first husband, a businessman twice her age, whom she marries in 1990. The marriage lasts a few years until Jane has an affair. Fergie helps her during this time and arranges a new apartment for Jane where she can stay. Around the same time, the marriage between Jane's boss Fergie and Andrew also falls apart. At first, Jane and Fergie are closer than ever. Jane jets around the world with her boss and is always by her side to offer advice and support. But cracks begin to appear in Jane's life once again. Her relationship with the Greek man ends in a fight during which she trashed his entire apartment. She is also said to have physically attacked him with a pair of scissors. It is even claimed that he paid her money so she would finally leave him alone. She presumably used that money to buy her own apartment in London. In 1997, she overdosed again, and shortly thereafter, she lost her job. Exactly why Jane Andrews was dismissed from her position remains unclear to this day. Rumors suggest she was let go after an Italian admirer of the Duchess showed inappropriate interest in her. Officially, Jane Andrews' dismissal was the result of cost-cutting measures. Following her divorce from Fergie, she naturally has fewer resources at her disposal. Just as quickly as Jane had risen more than 10 years earlier, she now falls again. From one day to the next, her dream of life among the royals is over. Instead of working in the royal family's palaces, Jane now works at a jewelry store owned by Annabel Jones in London's Knightsbridge district. Her mental health rapidly deteriorates once more. Until, in August 1998, an acquaintance suddenly introduces her to the man who will change everything: Thomas Cressman. Thomas is 37 years old at the time. He is self-employed in the stock market and a car accessories business, and through this, he has managed to achieve a high standard of living. Well, it certainly didn't hurt that his father is a multimillionaire, and Tom never had to worry about money. Tom, his brother, and his sister grew up in circumstances that are the complete opposite of the life Jane had as a child in Grimsby. He owns his own apartment in London's Fulham, his own boat, and a fancy car. He collects military memorabilia and is particularly interested in the German army of the Third Reich. In any case, you could say the man has expensive hobbies. To afford them, he spends a lot of time working. Until he meets Jane. The two see each other every day and can hardly tear themselves away from one another. Tom regularly brings his new girlfriend flowers. When Jane flies off on vacation with her friends, they talk on the phone every day. After 3 months of dating, Jane moves in with Tom. Jane had injured herself shortly before. She had been out dancing with Tom, and the two of them had been getting a little carried away. In the middle of a lively dance move, Tom let go of Jane, causing her to fall and break her wrist. Jane later claims that Tom did it on purpose and that he insisted she stay at his apartment after the incident so he could take care of her. Tom's friends, on the other hand, say Jane was more likely using her broken wrist as an excuse to move in with Tom. In any case, Jane moves in with Tom, and at first, everything seems to be going okay, until it all gradually becomes a bit too much for Tom. Because Jane is clingy and craves attention, Tom really notices this for the first time when he's at a bachelor party in Germany. When he lands there and turns his phone back on, he sees numerous missed calls and messages from Jane. She asks why he isn't calling back, and has sent several messages. Even though she knew Tom was on the plane and couldn't get in touch at all. And her controlling behavior goes even further. At some point, she starts reading Tom's emails. In doing so, she finds messages from a young woman Tom met on a business trip to the United States. Many reports claim the two had nothing going on, just email contact. But that's not entirely true. The Guardian had access to the emails as part of a report, and there were clearly intimate to explicit things in there. Obviously, Jane doesn't like that. What no one disputes, however, is how Tom describes Jane in one of the emails. To him, Jane is now like a pair of old slippers that he can't throw away. Jane doesn't take this email well at all. She confronts him, and an argument ensues. But in the end, the two patch things up, because they've planned a vacation in Italy. And that's reason enough to forget the conflict and look forward to the upcoming trip. Especially since they'll be spending a few more days afterward at Tom's parents' vacation home in France. Jane hopes that Tom might have organized the trip to Italy just as an excuse to propose to her there, but her hopes are dashed. The vacation is nice though. The two of them are out on several lakes, and Tom gets to go on long boat trips, one of his favorite hobbies. But Jane waits in vain for a ring, and she voices her disappointment loudly in front of friends. Jane insists that she absolutely wants to get married, and this despite the fact that she and Tom haven't even been together that long at this point. At this point, it might be worth taking another look into Jane's psyche. She comes from the humblest of backgrounds and has managed to go from the poorest town to the richest family in the country. She doesn't want to lose this new standard of living. Now she's with Tom, who comes from a wealthy family and has more than enough money himself. On top of that, she's been through numerous mental health crises, including at least 2 medication overdoses. It makes sense that Jane craves stability and security. How she reacts when that doesn't work out, however, is anything but logical. First, Jane and Tom get into a fight at the airport, and it ends with a huge blowout. In the heat of the moment, Tom tells Jane he'll never marry her. On the flight back, the mood is understandably at rock bottom. After such a row, it's clear that the relationship is going to change fundamentally. Tom falls asleep, trying to ride out the argument. Jane, on the other hand, asks the flight attendants for a few drinks to drown her frustration. At home, the argument continues. The next morning, Tom pulls the plug. He doesn't know how to deal with Jane's anger anymore. He feels so helpless that he decides to call 911. Tom asks for someone from the police to come by to separate the couple. Apparently, he feels he can't move forward without a third party. But the 911 operator doesn't recognize the seriousness of the situation. Apparently, they consider the conflict between Tom and Jane to be a normal couple's argument. Yet that line has long since been crossed. After being turned away by the emergency dispatch center, Tom calls a friend. The argument with Jane has been going on for 24 hours at this point. As Tom reports on the phone, however, the conflict now seems to be over. He tells his buddy that he broke up with her. Jane then apparently jumped in the car and drove off somewhere. Just as the friend is about to ask more questions, Tom brushes him off. Jane is just coming back home, and Tom avoids her at first. His office isn't too far from his apartment, so he retreats there for the time being. When Tom comes back home in the evening, everything seems to be okay for now. Jane goes out again. Tom is sitting in the living room in front of the TV. When he gets tired, he moves to the bedroom, but stays up for a while longer. At that time, the Olympic Games are taking place in Sydney. Tom is watching TV from his bed when Jane comes back. Although the two have technically broken up, Tom apparently doesn't want to just send Jane away. At some point, Tom takes off his glasses, places them on the nightstand, and turns off the TV. Maybe he's already fallen asleep when Jane smashes his skull with a cricket bat. The cricket bat belongs to Tom and is always kept in the bedroom. Jane strikes him several times on the head with it, but the cricket bat isn't the only murder weapon. Earlier that day, while Tom was still at the office, Jane had hidden something else in the bedroom. She had placed a kitchen knife under the bed. She uses that one multiple times as well. Tom has no chance of surviving. However, he is still conscious when all this happens. We know this because a lot of blood is later found in Tom's lungs. Jane locks the bedroom door, grabs a travel bag with her most important belongings, and takes off. It isn't until 2 days later that anyone notices Tom is no longer alive. It's a Monday, and Tom doesn't show up for work. His co-workers call the police out of concern. The investigators ring the doorbell at Tom's apartment, but no one answers, so they decide to go inside. There, they finally find Tom. Both his head and his chest have obviously been severely injured. The 2 murder weapons are still in the bedroom. In the apartment, the investigators also find 2 notes. One reads, "My dearest parents, I'm so sorry. There is no more pain inside me. XOXO. Jane." On the second, "Tom hurt me too much. He was so mean to me." Jane is long gone. After the attack on Tom, she got into her car and left London. She was actually supposed to work on Saturday, but called in sick. On Sunday, she was last seen by Tom's neighbors. Since then, she and her Volkswagen have vanished. The police are pulling out all the stops. Even Duchess Fergie is being brought in to help with the search. The investigators ask her to call Jane. They hope that Fergie can convince Jane to turn herself in. She doesn't answer, but Fergie leaves a message on her voicemail, urging her to turn herself in. But Jane doesn't do that. Instead, various friends receive hypocritical text messages from her. Do they know where Tom might be? It doesn't take long before Jane is located on the English South Coast. The police manage to track Jane's cell phone. A police patrol finally finds Jane in a parking lot in Cornwall. She is sitting in her car, having taken her 3rd overdose of medication. But this time, too, she recovers, only to be arrested as a suspected murderer. During the initial interrogations, the 33-year-old gives confused statements. At first, she claims she didn't even know Tom was dead. Then she says she killed him, but not on purpose. The 2 had had an argument that escalated. Jane panicked and ran away. However, she keeps changing the details of her version of events. This only makes it clearer to the police that she acted intentionally. Just like the particular brutality with which the crime was committed, self-defense is not a plausible explanation here. In addition, a story from Jane's past comes to light. Do you remember Jane's first husband? When she got together with him, he was actually in a relationship. One day, his girlfriend at the time received a box of chocolates. The sender was never definitively identified. But against the backdrop of recent events, the rumor mill is naturally in full swing. Perhaps Jane could have sent the poisoned chocolates herself in an attempt to eliminate the woman at her future husband's side. That is, however, really just a rumor for which there is no evidence. Yet Jane Andrews maintains that she killed Tom in self-defense. She still stands by this version to this day. To understand Jane's reasoning for killing Tom, we have no choice but to take a brief look into the victim's private life. Jane tells the police that Tom admitted to engaging in BDSM practices. This preference is partly confirmed by the emails Tom exchanged with this American woman. That's all well and good, and it's his own business. But Jane says she went along with Tom's preferences to do him a favor. And in doing so, Tom repeatedly crossed her boundaries and simply assumed her consent, even though she felt unsafe. On top of that, he kept getting abusive toward her. When you hear about relationships like this, which are at the very least toxic and, in the worst case, abusive, outsiders often wonder why someone doesn't just end the relationship. But it's not that simple. Jane explains the situation from her perspective as follows.
Why did I stay? There's no short answer to that. I stayed with Tom for 1,001 reasons. Because every time he became violent or abusive, he apologized and promised to change. Because he made me feel like I was the reason for his behavior. I reached a point where I no longer knew what was right and what was wrong. He played mind games with me. Why did he take me to the Cotswolds to look for houses there before we went to Italy? All his friends and family say that's just my imagination. That's why I hired my original lawyer to track down the real estate agent in Chipping Norton, where they found out that he had registered us as Mr. and Mrs. Cressman. It's little details like that that matter, so people will believe what I say.
Tom had certainly made it clear to her that he was serious about her and was planning a future with her. But he had also been violent toward her. And so the conflict escalated right before Tom's death. We only have Jane's perspective here, and it stands to reason that, as a murder suspect, she is trying to find an explanation for her actions. The voices of the victim's relatives will always be heard more here than those of the perpetrators. In a way, that's also my personal standard. Nevertheless, it's just as important to me to always give you as comprehensive a picture as possible. So keep in mind as you read the following that we cannot verify the details, but that, if they contain any truth, they may offer a starting point for an explanation. Jane confirms that it all started at the airport before their return trip to England. However, she also claims that, in the course of their conversation, she and Tom had agreed to go to couples therapy. The next morning, though, he changed his mind. Jane got angry. Tom told her to leave. A physical altercation ensued, during which Tom choked her. Afterward, he called 911, which was ignored, and then lost his temper with her again. During the altercation, he assaulted her and threatened that he would hurt her terribly and that no one would believe her. Afterward, he locked her in the walk-in closet. It wasn't until early afternoon that he let her go. Jane confirms that she then left the house and drove away. However, it can be proven that she and Tom exchanged text messages and calls in the time that followed. The text messages from both sides are full of recriminations and accusations. The situation escalated to the point where Jane threatened to take her own life. Tom's response was to even suggest a method to her. Nevertheless, Jane drove back to him later that evening. That night in bed, Tom is said to have once again attempted to assault her. Jane recalls that she had fallen asleep and was then awakened by Tom, who had hit and yelled at her. Only then did Jane take the cricket bat and strike Tom, acting in self-defense. She says she has only fragmented memories of the incident. She makes various statements regarding how and why she used the knife. Her explanations amount to serious accusations against Tom. Tom's parents, just like his siblings, are horrified by these claims. They feel betrayed by Jane in two ways. First, she violently killed their son and brother, and then, after his death, she tells stories about him that destroy his reputation. The Cressmans have no doubt that this is precisely the purpose of Jane's statements. She wants to make herself look better, and in her situation, that's only possible if she makes Tom look worse. The Cressmans' view is supported by the fact that several of Tom's ex-girlfriends confirm he was never violent. With Jane, however, the situation is different. Her ex-boyfriend also said she attacked him with scissors and trashed his apartment. so she had already drawn attention to herself in this regard before. Other people in Tom and Jane's circle view the situation somewhat differently than Tom's family. Take Lucinda Ellery, for example. She was close friends with both Jane and Tom. Tom had even called Lucinda on the morning of his murder to ask her advice on how best to deal with Jane. Lucinda thus seems to have had a very intimate insight into the conflict-ridden relationship. This makes it all the more intriguing that she describes a few things differently than Tom's family. At the time, there was a lot of talk in the media that Jane simply wanted to marry into a wealthy family at any cost, and that she had just snapped when that didn't work out. Lucinda says that the idea that Jane was a gold digger is complete nonsense. She genuinely fell in love with Tom, according to Lucinda, far more so than the other way around. Lucinda seems to see the problem more in this circumstance and less in Jane's fondness for a life of luxury. Lucinda considers Jane's claim that Tom abused her to be entirely credible, even though the relationship seemed toxic from both sides to her. She says,
"I thought the relationship would drive her to the brink and that she would take her own life, not his. I have no doubt that Jane had broken down by the time of Cressman's death. She wasn't doing well, either physically or emotionally. It was a tragedy waiting to happen, and unfortunately, the people closest to her couldn't recognize the signs because she hid it so well. It must have been a lot of pent-up anger. Tommy just set her off."
So Lucinda doesn't see Jane Andrews as a cold-blooded murderer, but rather as someone who desperately needed psychiatric help. We'll never know if that would have prevented Tom Cressman from being killed so brutally. The only question left is whether she truly acted in self-defense, as she claims, or with intent. Jane's initial denials at the time of the crime seem like an admission of guilt. Under cross-examination, she appears confused and contradicts herself. She argues that there are several reasons for her unfortunate behavior. Her reluctance to say anything negative about the deceased, her desire to protect her family, and the fact that she based her testimony on events she simply could no longer remember clearly enough. Above all, the jury seems unable to understand why Jane would have voluntarily returned to Tom on the same day after he had abused her. Such issues are very complex, and a psychological assessment would have helped. However, only a few expert reports are presented in court during the trial, and this despite the fact that Jane reports having been abused during her childhood as well. The alleged abuse by Tom on the day of the incident then sent her into a panic. Nevertheless, the jury quickly reaches a verdict. On May 16, 2001, Jane Andrews is found guilty of the murder of Thomas Cressman. She is sentenced to life imprisonment. In the UK, this does not mean life in prison, but a maximum of 15 to 20 years. And that is why, after only 14 years, it is decided that Jane Andrews may be released on parole. Since 2015, she has been able to lead a completely normal life again. She rented out the apartment she had bought in London for £30,000 a year. This allowed her to save up a good amount of money for her life after release. Nevertheless, she found another source of income. She's selling her old belongings, the items left over from her glamorous life with the royals. Jane is selling off all the mementos, porcelain plates, and cups from the royal family as a vendor at a permanent flea market. For Tom Cressman's family, it's incomprehensible that Jane was allowed out of prison so soon. Although Jane is said to have repeatedly shown remorse for the murder during therapy, she has never once apologized to Tom's family. That brings us to the end of today's video. It's heartbreaking to see how preventable Tom Cressman's death could have been. Whatever may have happened before his violent death, outside help could have prevented a tragedy at this point, if not sooner. Feel free to share your thoughts on the case in the comments. That's also a great way to support the channel. Other than that, there isn't much more to say. I hope you're having a good morning, afternoon, or evening, whichever time you're watching this, and I hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao everyone.